Unbelievable. So they haven't even reached the first defensive belt. And so for all of the bluster and hearing these reports in the Western media that the counteroffensive is sluggish, it's not going as well as they'd like, is really a total lie and a fantasy that it's not doing anything at all other than consuming Ukrainian lives and throwing these men into the meat grinder. So when Putin says yesterday that this is ground to a halt, he says, I see calm. There's really nothing going on. What does this mean then for any sort of offensive left? You've said this thing has been over. It's all that's left is the fighting. It's like the picking up of scraps at this point. So what will happen as the U.S. and EU continues to funnel weapons into this mess?
Well, the sad thing is that this offensive has no legitimate military objective because you can't achieve it. I mean, that's like me creating the Scott Ritter Space Agency and saying that it is my objective to be on Mars in a year and a half. And people say, well, that ain't never going to happen because you don't have the budget, you don't have the technology, you don't have the infrastructure. You got nothing but an idea. For the Ukrainians to say that they want to punch through the Russian defensives, get to the Sea of Azov, cut off Crimea, cut off the land bridge connecting Crimea to Russia, threaten Crimea and get the Russians to surrender is like me saying I'm going to be on Mars in a year and a half. It just isn't going to happen. It's incapable of happening. What the Ukrainians have to do, however, is create the perception that they can continue to pose a viable military threat to Russia worthy of the NATO investment in them. Now, what's happened so far with this counteroffensive is the exact opposite. What they're demonstrating is the truth, that no matter what NATO does, Ukraine will never be able to defeat Russia. Moreover, Russia will eventually strategically defeat Ukraine, regardless of the NATO assistance. And so Zelensky can't afford to have NATO roll into its summit on July 11th with this perception. So he is going to be compelled to continue to throw troops, double down on stupid, continue to throw troops into the breach because he has to show something on July 11th. But what he's going to show is the total destruction of the 60,000 strong Ukrainian force that NATO has been building since October of last year. It's going to be eliminated. And then the question confronting NATO is, do we do this again? And now here's the issue, because we now know that Leopard tanks aren't magic. They burn. They burn very well. We know that Bradley infantry fighting vehicles aren't magic. They burn. We know that the Storm Shadow is not a magic weapon. It gets shot down. And so now the question is, if they say, hey, we're going to continue to support, you can't use the same formula that has already failed. So the next wave of support will include F-16 fighters, ATACMS long-range missiles. You see, now we're escalating the issue further. And then when that fails, because it will fail, what's next after that? And we get into the ridiculousness where we have a former Secretary General of NATO, Rasmussen, talking about creating a coalition of the willing, that is NATO members operating not as NATO, but their own distinct coalition to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. So now we have that escalation. What happens when they get annihilated and you have the imagery of 10,000 Polish troops being marched into a Russian prisoner of war camp? Does Germany come in? And then if the Germany comes in, are they going to do it by themselves? Or are they going to articulate for an Article 4 covered by NATO? And now we have NATO-Russian involvement in Ukraine, and they are one step away from the world ending. This is the stupidity of this escalation. People need to stop this nonsense. NATO will never beat Russia. NATO will never beat Russia. That will never happen. The United States will never beat Russia. We don't have the military capacity to defeat Russia in a large-scale ground conflict in Europe. That is a statement of fact. We could put everything America has in Europe today, and the Russians will beat us because we're not that good anymore. Now, we could spend trillions of dollars to rebuild the American conventional warfighting capability, but that's going to take years. The army we have right now cannot fight the Russians. It's physically unable to fight the Russians. As General Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe and the Supreme Allied Commander, noted last January in a presentation he made to a Swedish Defense Forum, the scope and scale of the violence taking place in Ukraine between the Ukrainians and the Russians is beyond the imagination of NATO. Listen to what I just said, beyond the imagination. Now, if you're a military planner, that means you haven't imagined this, so everything you're planning for doesn't take into account reality. You don't have the firepower necessary. You don't have the force structure necessary. You don't have the tactics. You don't have the equipment. You don't have anything necessary to fight that conflict. And that's the state of play with NATO forces today. They spent the last 20 years preparing to do nation building in Afghanistan, low intensity conflict around the world, limited military peacekeeping missions in Europe. The last thing NATO has been preparing to do is put 120,000 men across the border to carry out large-scale ground combat against a peer-level force who is combat hardened and has been doing this for 15 months, is more prepared than they are. NATO can't do this, and yet van der Leyen, Stoltenberg, and others continue to pretend as if NATO has this capacity. They don't. NATO is bankrupt. They're bankrupt in terms of their training, their capacity. They've given all their weapons away to Ukraine. That's been burned up. They don't have the ability to build new weapons. Germany has just come out and they're sort of admitting that all this talk about spending 100 billion euros to rebuild the German army is just talk, because no matter what Rheinmetall wants to do, they can't afford the steel. Nobody can make this steel because of high energy costs. The raw materials necessary to build this military either can't be procured or are too expensive to be procured. And that's all of Europe is in that situation. So this notion of a rebuilt NATO army, et cetera, or in America, find a defense contractor right now that's prepared to do the short-term contracting necessary to produce the weapons that Ukraine needs. They won't. Why? Because their job isn't to create an American or a global defense capable of standing up to Russians. Their job is to make money. Their job is contracting. So they say, if you want us to do this, we need long-term contracts. So we produce enough equipment so that the profit margin is sufficient to make our investors and our board members happy. Russia doesn't have that problem. When Putin and the Russian leadership say, we need you to do X, Y, and Z, the Russian defense industry says, yep, we're doing it, because they work for the state. They actually care about the defense of the state. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon don't give a rat's ass, excuse my language, about the defense of America. They only care about the bottom line. And right now, they are saying, we're not going to do the short-term contracting that you want us to do to meet the supply requirements for Ukraine. We need longer-term contracts, but that's very expensive. And now we run into budget issues because Congress has to weigh in on that. And now we get a debate within Congress about whether or not this is the right thing to do.